Hey everybody, welcome to the Halloween special of the Dual Dialogue podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm an entertainment journalist here to talk about probably, if not one of the most iconic horror films ever made. But I'm not alone. It's called Dual Dialogue for a reason. It's not just listening to me talk for however long. I want to pick somebody that I think is well suited to talk about a certain movie with me. And I did things a little differently this time, where every episode of Dual Dialogue has been about a new release so far. That's not what we did for the Halloween special. I reached out to a past professor of mine at Chapman's film school, Tom McLoughlin. Tom, why don't you say hi to everybody and do a little introduce for yourself?
Hello, everybody. I still get taken aback hearing the word professor and my name together, but obviously that was the label I had to take on as far as I was concerned. I'm just a student of film and have been blessed enough to make a few, but it's the films that are the thing that you want to talk about and be feeling like, if you love something, you got to study it, and understand how it has its effect on you.
Yeah, you're a student as well, and as you said, you've made films, a few in the horror genre. And which is kind of why, when I took one of your classes at Chapman, visual storytelling, a few years ago, you talked a lot about horror films in class and in teaching us how to kind of make films and make our short films. So I wanted to reach out to you for a Halloween episode. And like I said, there were a few horror movies that have gotten released this year that I thought about covering, but for a Halloween special, I wanted to ask my guest, the first time I've done this, to pick a movie that they think should be discussed, a horror movie or any sort of Halloween-esque movie. And this was a hurdle for me. You picked William Friedkin's The Exorcist. As I said, one of the most iconic, well-known movies in the horror genre. I told you that, and this is probably going to turn away some listeners. I had never seen this movie before. This was my first viewing. It kind of surprised you. And you said from a religious perspective, it has a whole other layer to it. I am religious, so I was watching it kind of from that perspective, and that opened up so many more themes and questions. Um, Before we jump through the narrative and kind of go sequence by sequence and just hear about it and talk about it, Tom, you mentioned when I reached out to you that this was a big inspiration and it was one that kind of made you really curious looking at how kind of the world received this movie. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of how it inspired you and how it really opened your eyes when you saw it for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, my background in film was it's the son of a USC film student
Hmm.
uh, who, unfortunately, in those days, early 50s, nobody would hire film students. It was ridiculous. So he had to go out with his 60 millimeter camera and try to shoot documentaries or anything he could. And then obviously there wasn't any money in that. So he ended up buying the house right next to the old MGM studios. So I grew up with his dreams and the reality of having a backlot from a major studio behind me. So that was where I wanted to go. He was a magician, so magic came into my life. Then once the 60s hit, it was all about rock and roll, and you can see that influence is still with me. And then I went to Paris to study mime with Marcel Marceau to try to be a better performer. And when I came back, then kind of picked up where I left off, except I had no girlfriend, I had no band, but I had this, love of visual cinema, which is why I was, very excited to do a visual, storytelling class,
Hmm.
because it is what we perceive more than anything else is what we see and how we feel about it, not necessarily what we hear. As we all know, people are very good at lying, but lots of times, if you look for certain scenes or certain things in life where it's the body language that tells you a lot, or the eyes that tell you a lot. So, literally, it was Exorcist was 73, if I'm
Hmm.
right,
Yeah,
uh, December 26th, day after Christmas.
yeah.
And I hadn't been back that long from Paris. Like I got back in 72. So I was still sort of finding what I wanted to do and things. I love movies. I was very, very much wanting to get into that, but I didn't know to what capacity. So I had a friend, and I guess that was the night before New Year's, that I saw this friend of mine who had read the book Exorcist, gone and seen it, and had not slept since.
Yeah.
It was just terrified. And I went, I love horror movies and all that, and certainly grew up loving the Frankenstein monster and the Dracula, all the Universal ones, which also affected my work. But this made me have to go out and see this thing. Well, when you went down to, in those days in Westwood, there was a National Theater.
Hmm.
The lines were around the block. The writer and the director were there handing out hot cocoa and coffee to all these people. There was a there was a buzz that I've never felt before to go in and see this thing. And there was an ambulance out front. I mean, there was so much, you
Wow.
know, made you say, you know what, you're going into dangerous turf going to go see this movie. But to me, it's like, hey, it's got to be just a movie, and hopefully it's scary. And
Hmm.
I obviously I loved the Rosemary's Baby. I thought it was wonderfully
Hmm.
psychologically scary and things. And all the early horror movies, they became sort of like friends more than anything else. So I went in again, not having read the book, not knowing anything, and I really judge things on what's happening around me, and seeing people devastated. And I mean, literally, Cameron,
Hmm.
people passing out. There's like just a scene of you've seen it where
Yeah.
they
Hmm.
do the son Linda Blair's character,
Hmm.
men just passing out in their seat from seeing that. But it
Hmm.
was not just that scene; it was everything that sort of led up to that, and people just stunned, horrifically stunned, not wanting to walk out just because they couldn't move their bodies. It
Hmm.
really, I mean, I sound like I'm over exaggerating, but it really, that first initial introduction to this movie for everybody was something like they've never ever seen before. So
Hmm.
that made me go, you know what? I have to be a surgeon and dissect this thing. I got to figure out what makes this thing
Hmm.
so powerful.
Hmm. So for this being my first time watching the movie, I did something that may not have been smart to watch it, but I was home alone in my apartment, so I turned off every light in my house and turned it on and kind of literally like quote unquote like cuddled up on the couch ready to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was necessarily the visuals that scared me. I mean, as I said, the subject matter is very scary. But as this movie went on, it's about 2 hours long. As it kept going, I felt myself being more and more apprehensive about what was going to happen in this movie. I mean, it a lot of people will say, especially when a new movie releases, "Oh, don't hear anything about it, don't read anything, don't watch anything like a trailer, just go in blind."
Yeah.
And maybe it's because it's become iconic and I wasn't seeing it when it came out, but I feel like The Exorcist, at least for my experience watching it a few nights ago, was that because I was going in knowing how iconic it was and how scary it was and how changing the field of cinema it was and knowing the experiences of people you just talked about that saw it and were passing out and schools were banning it and stuff. I almost felt like the movie, or maybe my experience was elevated because I was going in knowing that this had a reputation behind it. And I
Mhm.
almost felt like a few choices the movie made, it was like the movie itself knew that you were scared watching it almost with how certain things were shot and how it foreshadows what's coming. Like it doesn't like any horror movie, there's parts of it that start out with a normal family, everyone's relatively happy, there's a sense of normalcy, but the whole time you know what's coming.
Yeah.
You've heard the stories, you know the scenes, you know what's going to happen, and when they actually hit, I was tense and I was nervous and I was yelling at the screen. But there's also a lot of humanity to this movie that I love. Like
Yeah.
there's I and we can get into it once we kind of go like sequence by sequence, but there's a sense of, and I love stories like this, a group of like ragtag characters having to band together against this huge evil, and they're grasping at straws, but they all care so much about saving this little girl. Like
Yeah.
it's for how graphic and violent and scary it is, it's it's pretty moving and it has a lot of drama to it, and
Yeah.
that stuck out just as much as Linda Blair with a bunch of makeup floating off the bed. Like it has a
Yeah.
lot that draws you in.
I'm really glad you said that about that. It still had an impact with you,
Mhm.
having known all the publicity and everything that's happened with that movie. And what is it, 50 years, 60 years? I can't remember how long it's been now.
Yeah.
Pretty close, I would guess.
Hmm.
Um, and like when they showed it at Chapman, where
Hmm.
obviously both, got to know each other, and as you as a student and me as a teacher there,
Hmm.
William Friedkin came with The Exorcist and showed
Hmm.
it to the film students there.
Hmm.
And my son was there because he came as wanted to be a director, and he's made it into the industry, thank God,
Hmm.
after a number of years. But
Yeah.
he's working the thing that because he's heard me talk about this thing his whole life, and
Hmm.
so he was expecting everybody to be devastated, but they weren't. I mean, they just sat there and kind of took it in, and certain jump scares they reacted to and stuff, certain things they laughed at that they probably shouldn't be laughing at, but it was so intense that was sort of the natural
Hmm.
reaction. And I think he said that, Friedkin was a little, disarmed by that. He
Hmm.
didn't expect that kind of reaction, and yet he's got to be used to it because, as the years go on and we see so many other things that are far more graphic than that.
Hmm.
Um, and if you weren't relating to the film as you were on the
Hmm.
humanistic level, which is why
Hmm.
to me it's so powerful, is
Yeah.
that you care, you're invested. The conflict is, I mean, who deals with that kind of conflict in their
Yeah.
lives? It's so extreme,
Hmm.
yet it's still like it really got down to how do we save this child,
Hmm.
from this entity that's completely taken over her? How do you remove that? Who's the
Hmm.
expert who's going to help? So, but
Yeah.
a lot of that stuff, yeah, I think over time for a lot of people, they might be desensitized to that. But I'm glad to see you went in with, an open mind, but at the same time cautious, having heard so many things, so that it did take you, on that dark, dark journey.
It was a mixed bag. It was a forebodingness and knowing that, oh man, there's gonna be, a lot of visuals and violence and things that are gonna disturb me. But then as it goes on, you just really connect with the characters, and you care about Reagan, who's the little girl played by Linda Blair. For people that don't know, you care about her and you want her to be saved, and not that, anyone watching this movie wouldn't care, but you do. You care for her and you want these characters to succeed, and that becomes more of a driving force than any visual that's going to scare you, I think, is
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll kind of go through this sequence by sequence. I told Tom off audio before we started recording that I literally have a note for probably every single frame of this film. Now I didn't go that in depth for the sake of his time and his day, so I
It's 3
wouldn't
o'clock.
tie him to this chair and force him to sit through every single scene. But I took a page of notes that I kind of want to walk through, maybe briefly or detail, however we want to do it. The movie, I mean, just I'm already going to go into it sequence by sequence, but
Yeah.
just the title card, the way it just, boom, The Exorcist. There's no music, there's no creepy sense of unease. It's even the title card of this movie, it knows that you know what you're about to watch almost. And I mean, you can't really make that an argument for maybe like the first group of people to ever watch it, but watching it 50 years after it's been released with this hype behind it, especially in the Halloween season, I mean, from the first frame and the first little sequence, which is about a dig site in northern Iraq, you're just waiting for something to go wrong and something to happen.
Well, I'm going to bring you up on the sound too,
Yeah.
because that has a lot to do with it. Yes, it's a
Hmm.
bold, intense,
Hmm.
logo or title of The
Hmm.
Exorcist, but that high, screechy
Yeah.
violin sound, which kind of harkens back to Psycho,
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
it's like sustained. And he was mixing, which I'll mention if we
Please.
get to all this. He mentioned he also put in the sound of animals screeching
Hmm.
and just screams or breaking glass, and changing the sound enough, but it was always something that would have an emotional connection in life on some level. So
Hmm.
that a lot of this stuff, just to jump ahead, when you see the camera rushing towards the door, and we
Yeah.
know she's behind that door,
Yeah.
he had shaken up bees, the
Hmm.
sound guys in a jar, and then multi-track that so that
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
actually bees. So it's not an artificial sound, it's a real sound. And their feeling was that no, we got to have this somehow connect right into our DNA, which we had no idea at the time how much we were being manipulated on that ride. But
Hmm.
you brought up the title. Yeah, it starts right there.
Hmm. There's a lot of moments with the noise that really unsettled me, whether it's kind of just the score or the sound choices he uses. I mean, sound, you're right to bring up kind of the way he used it because it's so creepy and it kind of you brought up the door, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but doors are used a lot in this movie kind of as a foreboding device. What's behind the door? What's on the other side of this door?
Exactly.
Um, and after the northern Iraq sequence, where we learn this later in the film, one of the priests is at a dig site and they kind of discover something that might be satanic. We jump back to Georgetown with kind of our central family of the film. Chris, played by Ellen Burstyn, who is incredible in this movie. We'll get into the performances, but incredible. And her daughter Reagan, played by Linda Blair, who's the titular kind of the person the demon possesses. And this is, like I was telling you in the intro, this movie knows that something is going to happen to Reagan. It tells you right away. She's the last character to be introduced in kind of this household. There's a sequence where after a day at school and Ellen or I'm sorry, Chris who works on movie sets comes home from work and they kind of talk, they have some banter and they're playing and like, cuddling with each other on the floor. And it's a shot of them kind of playing on the floor, Chris and Reagan through a doorway. And
Mhm.
very slowly the camera just pushes into this doorway and you just nothing happens. They're just playing and laughing on the ground. But you know, just from how kind of creepy this serenity is, it's not going to stay this way.
Yeah.
And like just the way the movie moves from this place of normalcy to this place of just everything's hit the fan is it's kind of slow, but because you always know it's going to get there, it keeps you invested the whole time. And the cinematography is, oh my gosh, it's incredible.
Yeah, the other thing I want to mention here too, because
Hmm.
some people probably already know this, but if you don't, Friedkin had just come off of French Connection,
Hmm.
and he won the Oscar. He was the toast of the town, and he took that same sort of documentary approach to The Exorcist, in terms of how he shot things, how he, the angles of things. It wasn't just like it was handheld documentary, but it did feel like you were there, and it wasn't anything that felt particularly staged.
Hmm.
If the characters are running up the stairs, he found a device that they could, he could move with the actors as they went up. I mean, certain things that are really kind of in that domain of a docudrama,
Hmm.
and that also really made us emotionally get pulled in. But then, like exactly like you said, there were those subtle little moves, that he would do, or certain types of framing, low end, just as a
Hmm.
filmmaking example, it had everything going for it, and that he used to again set you up for something that's about to come.
Yeah, it's the cinematography is beautiful and always was catching my eye. But like you kind of just described, it never really feels pretentious or like you said unnatural. It's very he just places it somewhere in the house and yet it ends up being the best place for the camera, whether it's kind of just like I said, pushing it on a doorway or just following characters around the house. Every shot feels like I said this when I was talking about one time, not on the podcast, just with maybe other people, the movie Jaws, where it feels like every shot is the right choice. Like it just
Yeah,
feels
absolutely.
right. Yeah. The other kind of half of the story outside of the family concerns itself with Father Karras, who's a priest who's having kind of a crisis of faith.
Yeah.
And having a crisis of faith, he's of course the person called on for the exorcism later. But I think it's Father Karras and Chris who are the 2 points of humanity in this story.
Hmm.
Like I mentioned, I was religious. I was watching religious, and I was watching this kind of with the subject matter scaring me, and you can make arguments about Father Karras's character, but I mean, you as the movie goes on, you really care for this man, and you can tell that he's a good person who, I mean, even with obviously we'll get to it far down the line, but with what the ending of the movie is, you really tell, and with these two characters especially, they just care about this little girl and they want to save her. And it was one of the most like, what's the right word for Father Karras? Like it was one of the most human portrayals I feel like I've seen. He just feels like a human. He's caring for his mother, which becomes a huge plot point in the movie. You can
Yeah.
tell he's a good person. He's a smart character in the way that he interrogates Reagan after she's been possessed. There's so many facets to him, but I loved watching him kind of go on as tense as I was from the subject matter and what was going to come next. I loved watching him really try to get to the bottom of this and with Chris really care for this girl's survival and want to get into that.
Yeah. And the way he was drawn, obviously from Bill's book, Platty's book,
Hmm.
uh, was a man that finally hit a point in his life, his career as a priest, that I think he uses the terms, I don't know how to help these people. I mean, it really gets down to faith. You
Hmm.
know, you could see he was questioning himself because there wasn't a whole lot that he could do to help them,
Hmm.
and to remind them all the stuff that's biblical and so on. But it just seems like it's gone now in his mind way beyond anything that he could find from passages in the Bible.
Hmm.
And part of the whole underlying thing of the movie is that they weren't targeting, or Satan wasn't targeting that little girl. He was targeting them, Marin and Karis, for two kind of different reasons, by putting their faith really to the test. And as without jumping to the end, we know kind
Hmm.
of what occurs because Father Karras did this. But you basically have a very wounded hero coming in, and
Hmm.
he should have been broken down. And God knows, the demon did everything he could,
Hmm.
to bring up his mother and talk to the mother's voice. Dude, all this
Hmm.
stuff that we've already seen now, how much this is hurting him, and how
Hmm.
his mother's saying to him, why were you not a doctor like your brother? You could not have me in this place and things. And he
Hmm.
just had so much guilt. So, I mean, it
Yeah.
really was that classic, religious person's guilt about life and why can't they do more? And,
Hmm.
and so it was incredible hero, from that standpoint.
Absolutely incredible. Kind of jumping into what happens with Reagan, the stages in which she becomes possessed. It's never really explained how exactly it happens, but it's kind of gradual. And I remember there's a shot again because in my head I know something's coming, something's gonna happen. There's a shot where Chris puts her to bed. It might be during that a dinner party she has with some filmmaker friends and just kind of other
Mhm.
people in the town. She puts her to bed, kind of, I think, kisses her goodnight, tucks the covers over, walks out, and you hold on Reagan asleep for a really long time, and then her eyes just open. There's
Mhm.
nothing inherently wrong or that looks uncomfortable, but just that visual, it's like the movie itself in terms of how long the shot is and Linda Blair's performance, and I imagine Friedkin's direction. Every aesthetic of this movie is indicating to you something is not right.
Yeah.
And she comes downstairs. She seems very out of it, like frazzled. She insults someone there who's an astronaut, telling him he's gonna die when he goes back into space.
Hmm.
She like pees herself, and everyone's very confused and uncertain of what's going on. And so Chris takes her upstairs and like cleans her up and is cleaning her in the bath. and she's just sitting there in a trance, like has doesn't have any life to her, is staring off into the dead of space. And there's a few other sections in the movie like this where Reagan, or at least maybe objects in Reagan's room, experience a sort of supernatural presence. There's a scene where she's screaming and Chris runs in and her bed is shaking like it's on like a
Hmm.
springboard, like back and forth. And in regards to kind of the humanity of the movie, what really scared me and made me more uncomfortable, and you kind of talked about it in the very beginning of our talk, was seeing kind of the psychological effects this has on Reagan is just her regular human self. They take her to like a hospital and they have to do scans of her brain and they have to draw blood. And I was a little squeamish in the scenes where they would inject needles into her in tubes and
Yeah.
pull blood out. But there
Yeah.
was one,
Classic male problem.
yeah,
Needles going in.
yeah. And there was one scene that really got me where they do a scan of her brain and they paint kind of like that liquid on her so the scan will go through. And
Hmm.
it's a shot of her in kind of a hospital chair and she's crying. And at first I thought, oh, it's maybe it's like the demon or it's the devil that is upset that this is happening. But no, it's just Reagan. It's just a little girl that is terrified of everything that's having to happen to her for them to get an answer out of this. And that's this little girl going through this psychological warfare scared me more than seeing her when she was possessed.
Yeah. Well, you also, as you know, you're led into this, a little at a time.
Hmm.
The whole thing of when she comes into the room and it's freezing cold. It's like
Hmm.
she closes the window, but it's still
Yeah.
icy in there. Doesn't necessarily mean any big thing. It could be
Mhm.
just that, yeah, it's a cold period, but they add it up and then sounds in the attic,
Hmm.
that are strange. And um, just that whole thing when, you see Chris McNeil's on the phone yelling
Hmm.
at her ex-husband. It's her
Yeah.
birthday and stuff, and the camera's pulling back to
Yeah.
reveal Reagan hearing
Hmm.
all this. Have we not all gone through hearing our parents fight, when we
Hmm.
were kids, or somebody that you're hearing and you don't know what to do with that, when you're a child. So
Hmm.
it adds to that thing of, wait a minute, does this have something to do with it, or is this just
Hmm.
part of her life?
Yeah.
Because literally after that, because before that was the whole thing about buying the horse and her
Hmm.
taking a little eyelash, which is an improv off her eye,
Hmm.
small tiny little details that made you care and again reminded you of the vulnerability and the humanity of these two. And then things just started to mount, more
Hmm.
and more and more until finally, obviously, she has to take her to a doctor. She has to bring in
Hmm.
specialists. And as we know, none of that was making any sense, and they were finding absolutely nothing.
Hmm.
So they, as doctors do, well, there's got to be some scientific reason for this.
Yeah.
So more testing. It's like, oh God, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
And it was, I did a movie on AIDS with
Hmm.
Molly Ringwald, and it was like the first movie that kind of dealt with that mystery. People
Hmm.
did not understand, and in particular, like with the true story I was doing, this was a female. Females were not supposed to get AIDS. It was completely a male gay related, you
Hmm.
know, uh, disease.
Hmm.
And she had a ton of experiments that were done on her. And I shot those pretty much not exactly like, but that same thing of going through that process with her and
Hmm.
watching how difficult it was. But so much of The Exorcist, those scenes were the inspiration of
Hmm.
making it so that you really felt like you were going through it with, the person and experiencing it not objectively, but,
Hmm.
subjectively.
Yeah.
And I could I could list pretty much every scene through that movie that didn't have or did have some sort of impact on something that I did later in terms of
Hmm.
a creative choice.
You were talking about how we kind of build gradually through all of this horrificness and this tension. And I think it's around this section of the movie, probably like middle of the second act, midpoint, where we really start to see the effect this has on Chris. I mean, we've talked a bit about the human aspects of this movie and how there's so much drama around just trying to save this girl. And I mean, Ellen Burstyn is incredible in this movie. I mean, I just love looking at her face and how pained she looks and how she goes from doctors to psychiatrists to surgeons. And it's not that people aren't concerned, but they're just kind of like, this is probably a psychological issue. We'll try this test, and it comes back with nothing. Well, we'll try it again. Comes back with nothing. Well, we'll send her to this specialist. Well, that specialist sent me back to you guys. Oh, well, we'll try again. I mean, they kind of go in circles, and she is like, can anyone help me? Like, can anyone really get to the bottom of this? And her desperation is so well acted, and I mean, I'm not a parent, and yet I was still like, so I was right there with her, wanting to for her to have an answer, for someone to help her out, which is kind of where Karis comes in. And I mean, you even said something when we were talking about Karis a little bit, which is that he, and maybe it's because he's having a crisis of faith, he's kind of coming from a perspective of, I'm not sure how to help you. I mean, the movie talks a lot about exorcisms are not common. They're really only still used in the Catholic Church, and even then, the Catholic Church is not vocal about it. And Chris has a line where she says, "We've never been religious, like we don't have any knowledge of these kind of things." And so it's almost like the movie is forcing you to get to a point where the only option left is the spiritual,
Yeah.
is this exorcism. And so as Chris is working through all these mortal or all these human solutions and nothing's working, you're almost elated when she meets the team of psychologists that go, have you ever heard about an exorcism? Like finally the men of science are yielding to this spiritual presence that the whole movie is kind of throwing around. But
Yeah. Yeah. It's that journey of trying to find an answer. And I just went through a very similar thing with a dog that I just lost. I was doing everything I could to save him because he
Mhm.
had some sort of eating disorder.
Mhm.
And, I must have spent $60,000 on credit
Mhm.
cards
Yeah.
trying to save him. And I would get as angry as she would at these people when they didn't have answers or
Mhm.
ideas of what could stop this because he's
Mhm.
this wonderful animal and he's innocent to what he's doing,
Mhm.
but what else can we do? And same thing when, if they dared said in euthanasia, I would
Mhm.
immediately go, no, fuck you. No, we're not
Yeah.
going to, because it's like, this is my boy. This is,
Mhm.
and all of that stuff that I hadn't experienced in those days, with that kind of a thing. And
Mhm.
most of us who were teenage or in our early 20s are seeing it, we weren't married. We didn't have any kind of relationships like that. We couldn't necessarily relate to a child like her unless she was like our
Mhm.
sister or you were female and that was
Mhm.
like you when you were young. And oh my God, the identification was so strong,
Mhm.
whether you actually, were that person in that place. Obviously not, but she finally got to this point, or I should say the doctors are going with a sort of a smirk. Well, there's always this, and if it's psychological, maybe she's picked up something, talk to this guy because
Mhm.
he's a, priest and a psychologist. And of course he's going, no, no, you don't want to do this. They're really difficult things to go through.
Yeah.
It's the last thing she needs. And of course, she explodes. Her fucking bed was jumping up and down,
Yeah.
just looking around, like,
Yeah.
the language talking to a priest. I mean, there were so many little touches like that,
Mhm.
again, what Friedkin did, with the way he directed the actors, a lot of manipulation on the actors too.
Mhm.
Just so you know, when he didn't like something, he fired off a gun. He had the other actors say something that was so personal to that actor that it
Mhm.
elicited a response that was not in the script, but the
Mhm.
reaction was genuine. Friedkin wanted us to feel through these characters, however he had to do it, and as
Mhm.
ever angry as they could get at him,
Mhm.
um, he wanted us to go on this awful ride
Mhm.
and be with her, this whole time, whatever that she can open up that door to allow these guys in, to save her
Mhm.
daughter.
Yeah, and the movie, which not that this movie would ever have been made that way probably, but Chris's desperation works because you've also experienced what she's experienced. If the horror elements like the bed shaking or, the windows breaking, or Reagan throwing people across the room was kind of shown from you like in a more passive way, or it was just like a flickering light in a window and you were supposed to infer something was going on. Like if you don't see explicitly what happens, and then later on Chris is explaining this to them, it's not going to work. You have to see exactly what she sees. And so because we've seen a completely normal, innocent Reagan be on top of a bed that's lifting off the ground, for a doctor to then go, "Oh yeah, that Reagan was probably just doing that in an episode." No, that's not what happened. That's not
Yeah,
what we saw. It frustrates you because you've seen exactly what she's seen, and these kind of off the cuff, flippant answers are so
yeah,
frustrating because you know that is not what happened. And
yeah.
oh my gosh.
Yeah, just to
Go ahead.
off on a sidebar here.
Yeah.
If any of you or anybody out there has ever had a supernatural experience of some sort, whether it's
Hmm.
seeing a ghost, feeling something, um, whatever, that if you try to explain it to somebody else, they're sort of
Hmm.
looking like you're serious, right? It's
Hmm.
like, I swear to you, I don't believe in these things. Or that frustration of knowing what you saw or felt or experienced it a couple of times, that you go, I know there's more than news, weather, and sport out there. There is another universe. There is another realm.
Hmm.
And sometimes when you pierce that in some way, you feel so alone,
Hmm.
that you don't know how you explain it to other people until you find those people who go, exactly, you know what that is, and then they can quote somebody,
Hmm.
that is a spiritualist.
Yeah.
But this movie is just filled with that, where we are now on the side of the supernatural, going,
Hmm.
no, 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 don't listen to these stupid doctors and science and stuff. No,
Hmm.
this is what it is.
Yeah.
So this is what had a lot to do with people going back to church after that movie. I mean, it
Yeah.
really shook up people, whether they were religious or not. It's like, you know what? There's something else out there, and I sure as hell don't want to be that, like that little girl, or have
Hmm.
anything happen like that to my life. Maybe I better go and see if I can get in tune with God here.
Hmm.
So again, that's why this movie had such an incredible impact, and it was beyond just a piece of entertainment. It really had a life changing, reaction to a lot of people. Certainly me as a filmmaker, wanting to know, how do you do, the magician? How do you do these illusions? What did he do? How did he do it?
Yeah.
To make this thing. But the story, that Blatty had created was based on a true story, except it was a boy in 1949 that was possessed.
Hmm.
And the Jesuits had all these records. So a lot of those things that were recreated had come from, this particular case. So
Hmm.
you felt that, what, they're not lying to us.
Hmm.
There's a backbone to this thing that makes it all the more frightening.
We cannot talk about this movie if we don't talk about Linda Blair and kind of the makeup effects and the production design. I think she probably, along with the shot of walking into the house, which has become the poster, are kind of
Yeah.
like the two most iconic imageries of this movie. And as Reagan gets more and more fully possessed, her skin loses color. And for listeners, I put images over the pictures. I'll let you know when the images are coming if you don't want to look at them, but she has her skin loses color. It looks like she's scratching her face. As the movie goes on, you get more and more scared every single time you go in that room because you don't
Yeah.
know what the heck is going to happen next.
Yeah. Yeah, it's obviously it's like with Psycho, ending that first act with Janet Leigh's death, and
Hmm.
it's so intense that people, especially in the 50s, were just shocked. And now what could be worse? I mean, you just killed the lead of the movie. Where is
Hmm.
this going now? And Hitchcock really wanted to create kind of a new kind of cinema, where it's not just the normal rules that you get involved with somebody even though they're doing something criminal, and then it goes on.
Hmm.
This had that whole thing of, there was so many stories attached to this with the individuals, and you felt kind of all that, whether it was, the director sitting there in the kitchen, teasing the German butler, about
Yeah.
Nazis stuff. I
Hmm.
mean, and then he's killed. And it's like,
Hmm.
those two things have to do with anything?
Hmm.
Probably not. Uh, but who knows? It certainly, gets us thinking about
Hmm.
everybody's approaches to what the situation is
It's
that they're involved
3:30.
with and what the repercussions are ultimately. The use of the Ouija board is another thing that's
Yeah.
huge. That some people, again, it's Parker Brothers made this thing years ago as a toy, as a fun thing. It's not. And I mean, if if you don't believe in that, fine, I get it. But I have seen way too many situations that have occurred in life, and I've had people say to me, playing around with a Ouija board is pretty much the same thing as opening your front door and going, "Hey, anybody want to come in? Come on,
Hmm.
who's going to come in? The normal folk or
Hmm.
something else?" And that something else is what happens with the Ouija board is you're opening yourself up to any number of things. Sometimes it could just be psychological, but then there's that thing of energy and things that can get picked up and stuff. And they made use of that in that way that that whole Captain Howdy,
Hmm.
the name he used to
Hmm.
Linda to make it seem like, oh, it's just a kind of a fun thing. And then you see
Hmm.
the little, what's I think, parquet, the little thing that you move,
Oh, like
move on its own.
yeah.
And she's like, whoa, so
Hmm.
again, they're taking something that really, especially in those days, it was looked like it just a toy thing.
Hmm.
But when it goes back in the history of occult beliefs and sciences and stuff, that is an opening to bring this entity to her, whether that was his intention or just sort of happened. We don't know, and it's better not to know because you can talk about it afterwards and discuss it.
Hmm.
But that
Yeah.
is, again, they've used so many devices to sort
Hmm.
of allow you to believe what you're seeing
Hmm.
instead of just believe it.
Yeah. There was actually a sequence, and we both kind of talked about it, how the fear escalates, where Father Karras, he's we should mention real quick before we kind of move towards the third act kind of climax, is that Father Karras has been making regular visits to the house. I mean, I love the scene where Chris comes to him and just breaks down and tells him, I don't know what to do. I don't even know if this is gonna work, but I want to talk to a priest, and he's kind of taken aback. Like you really see the humanity. And he's been making regular visits to the house using like tricking the devil into thinking he has holy water, kind of trying to figure out if this is real or not. And he gets called back in one scene where they find out that either Reagan has done it or somehow written on her chest are the words "Help me."
Right.
And the way it's shot is it's at nighttime. He's rushed back to the house. He's going up the stairs in the dark. When I tell you, this was the first moment where I've talked about the visuals are gross and graphic, and the subject matter is scary, but the visuals aren't always scary. But when I tell you, I was actively scared of the
Yeah.
camera panning up to that door, thinking, what the heck are we gonna see this time? Why was he called back? Why are they freaking out? Why was he rushing into the house? He, Friedkin and company really get you to a place where you're just like, where can we go from here?
And you mentioned too something that I think is also really, I mean, I remember it really confused me. And then when I sort of thought about it over the years and all the different versions of the movie that I've seen, that when they added certain things back in, and they really didn't want to let this moneymaker go. So if there
Hmm.
could be anything to
Yeah.
get you back in, oh, now it's in stereophonic, something's come up with stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but that moment when he takes the holy water and
Hmm.
throws it on her, and the demon goes, it burns. And then later he says, that wasn't holy water, that wasn't
Hmm.
blessed. That was just normal water.
Hmm.
And you go, wait. So he's screwing with him. Obviously, he's
Hmm.
he's making him test that faith. Okay,
Hmm.
now here's a reason to say, well, maybe it's not anything demonic.
Hmm.
And just the whole thing of even when he says, and I'm the devil, I'm loosening these straps. He's going, you know what? This is not just a demon. He's calling himself the devil. That's wrong. It's not. And you get into that whole thing of what William Peter Blatty, spoke about that is biblical. Legion. The third Exorcist movie was called Legion
Hmm.
because who are you? We're Legion. That there's many demons running around here, and again, that sort of opens it up to maybe it wasn't specifically Satan, the devil, but part of his minions, somebody that had that same ability to go in and test people's beliefs. And in particular, if you can, destroy a priest, person of God, makes Satan very happy because there's always been that contest, obviously biblically, in who's more glorious, the most beautiful angel he created, Lucifer or God. And Lucifer makes his choice to be earthbound and do what he's going to do and try to get people, under his influence, which he does very well down here for those who believe, and and God having to fight with his warriors. In this case, we have these two priests
Mhm.
and a woman who had no experience in that, having to trust and put her faith in these guys that they're able to do this.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just, again, one of the most ultimate battles that you can have, that either is complete mental illness that creates this, or it's another part of what reality is. And I go back to auras and things that we've seen in biblical paintings over the years and stuff, and that can be photographed with Kirlian photography, that we all have these glows that change color, and you can photograph it. So it's not like something we're making up here, or it's not something that the great painters just came up with. It's something that they felt was very real and then added. So those elements of science and the mystical arts coming together is always going to be that. Well, can you prove it? Well, if you could do it 3 times in a row, that supposedly makes it a science. Most times it doesn't work that way, but when it does, it becomes that, okay, we really got to think about this, because
Mhm.
this is not falling into the pattern of just arbitrary. This is seemed like there's a recipe for this. And when you go back and analyze the movie, there is so much that they did, either consciously or unconsciously, that did evoke all that and did evoke it in us, in our basic fears of there is something evil out there. It doesn't always look like Reagan's demon. It can just be, the most beautiful girl you've ever met that manages to lead you down this road that you go, man, she was evil. I don't know what else to say. I know. And same thing with women to get involved with abusive relationships. The man is handsome, he's nice, he's loving and stuff, but he is destroying her for reasons that make no sense. But if you go back and look, there may be a series of abuses that have happened in the past that somehow get passed along. And that's all that stuff that The Exorcist makes you question, and which makes it more than just Halloween, where guy
Mhm.
with a knife,
Mhm.
even though it's a little bizarre what he's able to do,
Mhm.
that doesn't have as many ramifications as The Exorcist has. So it is one of those ones that every time you revisit it, depending where you are in your life, it can have a different, effect on you.
Yeah. We'll move into then the last sequence, which I think opens up a whole other set of questions with how it ends. But the actual exorcism in question, that is part of the title of the movie, is carried out by Karras and Lancaster Marin, played by Max von Sydow, who I'd actually, again, another knife to your heart. Not only did I see The Exorcist for the first time, I actually think the only other Max von Sydow performance I've seen is he's in the very beginning of The Force Awakens, one of the new Star Wars movies. I know his history, but I'd never seen him in this role, never seen him really in much else. But
Yeah,
um he's called to do the exorcism. He has some experience there. They mentioned that I think he's done an exorcism in Africa, and he was in the dig site in northern Iraq in the opening of the movie.
right,
So he and Karis go in there. They start administering the prayers, the sign of the cross. And they step outside to rest. And maybe you can explain this for me because why does there's as they step out to rest after they do the first round of prayers before they go back in, and Marin goes into the bathroom and takes like some pills. Now, do you know
his
exactly what
heart,
was?
his heart medicine.
Yeah, her. Okay,
I think that's mentioned with the priests when they're deciding whether to send him or not. He hasn't
okay,
been well and
okay.
stuff. So he's got a huge handicap going into this.
Okay. Yeah. Well, he goes back in the room to continue it, and this is where kind of the biggest visual effects of the movie happen. Reagan is floating off the bed. I mean, windows are crashing, objects are flying around the room. Karis and Marin are getting thrown around. And Kara steps out because it's getting to be a bit too much for him, and Marin sends him out and says, "I'll do this alone." And in probably the biggest moment of seeing Karras's character is where he goes downstairs. You can tell he's really shaken up. Chris, who is also downstairs and is crying, asks him, "Is she gonna die? Or is she what either is she going to die or is she going to be okay?" And Karras just looks up, doesn't break a sweat, doesn't break down, he just goes, "No." And he stands
Yeah,
up and runs back upstairs, and he finds that Marin died. Has either died or has been killed, and he attacks Reagan's fully possessed, so it's not Reagan, but he attacks her. And
yeah,
this is something that honestly made me, as I was thinking about it over the last few days since I saw it, it struck me as like something like probably, which he's not her parent, but something like my parents would do for me is he starts yelling like, "Take me, just take me, just take me." And so the demon leaves Reagan's body, goes into him. And I love whether this was a choice by Friedkin or the cinematography or the actors that you see Karras in kind of who I should say I've neglected to say the whole episode is played by Jason Miller. Absolutely fantastic, Oscar nominated. But anyways, you see a quick shot of him kind of done in the same makeup as Reagan has been, which his face is kind of grayed out and his eyes are yellow and sunken in. And then it just cuts back to regular human Karis again, real quick. And you see Reagan, who's now her normal self because there's no one in her anymore, and she's crying and screaming. And I love the quick edit between the possessed and the regular Karis because to me, it was showing that he is the one that ultimately is having the control. He's
yeah,
overpowered the devil in his body. And because he's not going to hurt Reagan, and this is a really sad ending because we've spoken about how much we love him and love the humanity in him, but he dives out the window and falls down like 4 flights of stairs and dies, gets administered his last rites, which I was sad with this ending because I loved him as a character, but I don't know if his aim was he wanted to die so that the demon wouldn't have a body, or his aim was a little bit confusing, but I appreciated that he was willing to take it on for Reagan, if that makes sense.
yeah. Oh,
I
yeah. It's a huge. I can't really make any other comparison other than from religious standpoint. Is very much the Jesus thing. Jesus was made
Mhm.
human. He allowed himself to be whipped, beaten, all that stuff, and
Yeah.
die on the cross. And even says to his father, "Why have you forsaken me?" You
Hmm.
know, it's like that's the human side coming in. And what they did so brilliantly with this is that, Karras had to give his life to save
Hmm.
this girl ultimately. And you
Yeah.
see the possession happen, and then he fights it and fights it. And as soon as his face goes back to normal,
Mhm.
bam, he's out that window.
Yeah.
That moment of clarity, I've
Mhm.
got to kill him because he's not going to go back into that girl. So
Mhm.
incredible sacrifice,
Mhm.
which is what the whole Catholic Church is kind of based on is the
Yeah.
extreme sacrifices of blood,
Hmm.
um, to have that alignment with God through Christ. And so all the Catholic things, and of course, I was raised Catholic.
Hmm.
My father went through 8 years of cemetery of the
Hmm.
seminary. I was going to say
Yeah.
cemetery, but and his parents, that's all they wanted of him. And he didn't do that. He went into show business instead. So my mother, who had just become Catholic to marry him,
Hmm.
her sights were set on I was going to be a priest. So I had all that kind of indoctrination all the way up to about the eighth grade when I didn't go with my friends who were going to seminary. I chose to go to regular Catholic high school instead.
Hmm.
And it was, my father wasn't disappointed as much as my mother was on that.
Hmm.
But there's a guilt that comes up because, like, were you set to be this person or did you make a choice that was not the right choice or not?
Hmm.
And that whole thing is, again, we don't know all the backstory of Marin and Karis, but we definitely get there's an awful lot of damage that has happened to them in
Hmm.
this search for God and what their role is down here and helping
Hmm.
people, and never feeling it's enough. But here, Karis does the extreme, and it there was a ending that they actually shot. I don't know which version you saw, if you saw the detective and the priest walking away at the end about, and they sort of start the bond. That was a thing that Friedkin did not want in that movie. And him and
Mm-hmm.
Blatty fought bitterly over that. And finally, Friedkin convinced him. But for years, Blatty always says, he didn't end on that sort of positive note that these two guys found each other.
Mm-hmm.
He says, no, I want to leave them shocked
Mm-hmm.
and letting them think about it. Don't wrap it up with a little bow. And
Mm-hmm.
I can't say I don't agree with him because it
Mm-hmm.
left all of us at that time very much alone with all
Mm-hmm.
this, and that there
Yeah.
wasn't any good thing that came out of it. And that wonderful moment again where Reagan, is looking at the priest and she doesn't know him, she's never met him before, but sees the collar, and that triggers, a memory, something, a
Yeah.
flash. And so she
Mm-hmm.
kisses him.
Mm-hmm.
And, you see her face is all scarred up from
Yeah.
the abuse that she has done to herself, which again, it all kind of makes sense logically, how this whole thing, and because other movies could just, now she's back to normal. She looks normally. No, the
Mm-hmm.
scars have to be there.
Yeah.
And I would be amiss if I don't share this one thing with you
Please.
as a huge Exorcist fan. I got to know Linda Blair
Oh,
over the
wow.
last maybe year.
Mm-hmm.
Linda has incredible regrets having made that movie. She
Mm-hmm.
certainly doesn't regret the fame she's gotten for it or the
Mm-hmm.
fact that she's a huge animal activist and she's been able to save tons of animals that she goes down and picks up, 8 dogs and brings them to her ranch and takes care of them and things. But the way she does that, obviously, is autographing things from The Exorcist, of
Yeah.
which she still has, a cracked vertebrae in her back from that, where she was being pumped on that bed. All that
Yeah.
jump messed her up. Same thing when she whacks um, Ellen Burstyn. When
Mm-hmm.
Ellen falls against that wall, she seriously injured her back and
Mm-hmm.
has to live with that pain.
Yeah.
And it was again, Friedkin was kind of pushing way beyond what would be normal,
Yeah.
for a director to do. But Linda's very much, like she questions because so many people, when she's autographing things and she's being really nice and stuff, and people take pictures with her and she grins and stuff. But every so often, there's that one person that stands back and just stares at her and she goes, oh no. And sure enough, when they wait till other people aren't there and they come up to her and say, the devil has you. What you did was to celebrate the devil. You're going to be in hell. I mean, just horrible things that
Mm.
she goes, I'm sorry, I've got nothing to say to you and stuff. But there's people that took this thing so seriously. They literally like blamed her of all
Mm-hmm.
people, a young girl whose mother, if anybody, allowed it,
Mm.
but she was so advanced in her maturity to be able to pull off some of the stuff she pulled off. I'm
Yeah.
also friends with Eileen Dietz, who was her double, who
Mm-hmm.
did a lot, was the Pazuzu face that you see, the painted face
Mm-hmm.
is actually Eileen. So there was a lot of controversy over when Linda was nominated. Was Eileen telling the truth? A lot of that stuff was her or not. No, it was very specific shots that they used
Mm-hmm.
Eileen for.
Mm-hmm.
But Eileen's got a whole career now of autographing things because she was part of Reagan.
Yeah.
And Linda's completely in the other direction. I don't want to be doing this, but for the sake of the animals and what I'm doing with my life that I want to do, this is all helping. So it's really interesting how a movie like this had such an impact on all of us. And yet, when we look at it now, 50 years later, how people are dealing with it if you were involved with it in any level.
Mm-hmm.
And, most of them have moved on. We just lost Friedkin just a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but I followed him like, you know, flies on what. Anytime I
Mm-hmm.
found he was going to be someplace and questioned and asked, and if the DP was going to be somewhere, if Blatty was there. And I was actually offered to do the prequel to The Exorcist,
Oh, wow.
uh, maybe about 10, 15 years ago,
Oh, wow.
and was like, oh my God, how am I going to go and come anywhere close to that? I'm not.
Mm.
And William Peter Blatty did not want them to do the prequel. which was about how Marin almost completely, lost his faith and died,
Mm-hmm.
by the devil's hand when he discovered a church, a demonic church down underneath an actual church. And it's
Mm-hmm.
the whole backstory from Africa, that standpoint. And I was on that for like 2 years. And it messed with my head. I have to be honest. I really was in a dark place reading all this stuff about real exorcisms and, anything I could find on demonic possession or demons or, God versus Satan, all this. And even though I was still working and making other movies, and this was the thing that we were, moving towards, trying to find the right writer for it, it had a very heavy effect on me. And I thought I could blow past it. But there is something when you start to mess around in that universe, there is residual things that seem to come from it. And they talk about that, the people who made the movie, how many deaths there were. And you could say, well, that just happens on a long shoot. There'd be people that die and stuff. But then there were fires. There was all this stuff, which they made also part of the publicity that this
Mm-hmm.
is an evil movie. You want to see evil? Come to this movie and see if you can take it. And that challenge made a lot of people come. And then they sort of like, you know what? I could have done without that. I didn't need
Yeah.
that because it really did have a huge effect on them. But purely as a filmmaker of what they did and how magnificent it was in terms of how he accomplished what he did and how it still obviously has effect on you seeing it and all you've heard is word of mouth about it,
Mm-hmm.
that it really was a use of cinema in a way that's kind of unlike it's ever been before. People were scared of Frankenstein when the original came out. I just
Mm-hmm.
saw the latest one, Guillermo
Mm-hmm.
del Toro's version,
Yeah, me too.
complete in re-envisioning, but very close to what Mary Shelley wanted in her book, where
Mm-hmm.
Frankenstein is actually good looking. He's not this ugly monster. And all the psychological things that Guillermo put in that movie, it's one of those ones you see another time to appreciate how much detail. And again, it goes back to the Catholic influences too, that because he grew up that way in
Yeah.
Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
that you feel. So again, a long story short, it's just there's certain movies, and this is why the one when you said, well, what one would you bring? I have so many that I favorites, but then there's this.
Yeah.
That is the one that never goes away in terms of my, well, if you want to ask me what's the best movie ever done, that. But if you add, we have a group called the Masters of Horror, and
Mm-hmm.
it's all these people from Guillermo to all the people that did, the Saw movies to the people that did, Hammer horror movies,
Mm-hmm.
all get together. And one time, I think it was uh, John Landis was there, and he said, oh, and stopped everybody, like 40 people. He goes, okay, what is the most horrific horror movie of all time? I mean, you guys are all horror directors. You should have something that you
Mm-hmm.
feel without a doubt. And everybody's like murmuring and, Exorcist, and all these like strange, low budget things that disturb them,
Mm-hmm.
what Texas Chainsaw or whatever. And then somebody said, the Christ, that is the most horrific horror movie that's ever been made.
Mm-hmm.
And the consensus was, yeah, Jesus did not deserve or have that amount of beating for some just weird psychological reason with the Romans. There was a much bigger sickness and thing to that. And that horror, which made it have an R rating, and didn't want kids to see it, you know, definitely everybody had to agree. Yeah, if we're just going pure horrific, shouldn't have happened. That's it. And I thought that was amazing that all these guys who've made their careers off of doing horror movies, from John Carpenter and Joe Dante, all these guys, that was the agreed one.
Mm-hmm.
And again, religious.
That's The Exorcist. We've talked about what we both took away from it, your inspirations from it, kind of what it did to cinema and people when they first saw it. Um, the way I kind of want to wrap up, Tom, and how I kind of wrap up my episodes is for people that want to maybe watch some of your films or learn more about you or more about your influences, where can they find your stuff?
Well, interestingly enough, um, and I didn't realize that until somebody actually did a book on my life in films, because I didn't think there was really anything to do a book on. But this filmmaker saw in it like how strange a path somebody who wants to be in the entertainment world and at the same time make movies and have a life. And it seemed like every 10 years I sort of changed careers,
Hmm.
starting with being a kind of a magician filmmaker as a kid, and then
Hmm.
through the 60s, a rock and roller, which led to mime, which led to writing, which led to directing, producing, and, all the way back to rock and roll again in 2010 when the band from the 60s got back together. And I continue, this path of never kind of knowing where the road's going to lead, but
Hmm.
still heading towards something that is somehow purpose driven. And I don't know exactly what that purpose is. So he actually named this book A Strange Idea of Entertainment, the films and discussions with Tom McLoughlin.
Hmm.
And that's a line that's actually in my Friday the 13th Jason Lives movie is
Hmm.
a character looks right at the screen. It says some folks have a strange idea of entertainment,
Hmm.
meaning us and me,
Yeah.
filmmakers.
Yeah.
So in that uh, body of work, there's like 52 feature films that I've made. And it's weird because I never thought about looking backwards. I was always going forward. So in terms of finding my stuff, if you go on IMDb and just obviously put my name in there, you'll see a list of all the stuff, plus episodes, plus stage things that I've done and so on. The
Hmm.
book, which is on Amazon, is probably the most telling because that kind of really gives my backstory, all the things that influenced me, what led me to Chapman
Hmm.
ultimately, and the rebirth of the band. And now I'm in this kind of weird thing where I have a band again because COVID actually stopped all the performing that I was doing. The writing, I keep writing things, but now I'm in a, what they call the gray zone, where it's like you're looking for who's just come out of film school, who
Hmm.
hasn't done anything that hasn't been, successful or
Hmm.
non-successful or have a lot of promise, as
Hmm.
opposed to if you got as many films as I have had behind me, you go, well, this one was great and this one worked, but this one and this one, it's a
Hmm.
much harder time to, be the guy, that the go-to person when
Yeah.
you have something that succeeds, absolutely everybody wants, to get you involved because you have some sort of
Hmm.
magic. So obviously IMDb has it. YouTube, if you put in Tom or Tommy McLoughlin, you'll see stuff from the bands. You'll see so many interviews, you'll throw up. There's so many times I've been talked to about different aspects of my Friday the 13th or
It's four o'clock.
One Dark Night, which was my first little low budget film
Hmm.
and a Stephen King movie. And so I really kind of dabbled in that world of horror and psychological, and then went into true crime, went into, a Santa Claus movie, a
Hmm.
fairy tale, a true story. I've had this incredibly eclectic, decision making process that if I had just done something that's like a warm family drama, I immediately want to go into something like the DC Sniper, and you go, what? It's like, yeah, I want to understand why that happened and what
Hmm.
happened and stuff. So it's always been about kind of challenging myself. And, as you'll see, it's sort of like I've had so many times people go, you made Lifetime movies and yet your favorite movie is Exorcist? I said, no, my favorite movie is A Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
That's what, if I was going to go on the desert island, that's where I would go. But
Hmm.
if we're talking scare and influence me on that darker side of
Hmm.
life, yes, The Exorcist is the one. But in
Yeah.
terms of what I want people to see themselves and see how one person can make a difference, which is what Frank Capra did with his work. And I was very fortunate to have him as a mentor in the later period of his life.
Yeah.
That's what I think, movies should do is you come in with a vision and hopefully you leave behind on this planet something that is worthwhile, something that gets people to think and maybe make more positive decisions or maybe not mess with something that they think, oh, that sounds like fun. Because I've
Yeah.
certainly seen people have really bad reactions to things they got involved with that they never thought that would happen to them. And unfortunately, all those real monsters of life, addiction, alcoholism, mental illness, you know, uh, obviously any kind of thing that's in the paranormal that we don't believe and things can happen, or just sociopaths and psychopaths, where I've learned from talking to these people in prisons and things, no guilt at all. sleep well at night and you go, oh my God, how can that happen? And or they can disavow having done this horrible crime or series of crime, and the meters just float. They do not show any kind of reaction. And you realize there is something that can happen that's really dark. So that fascinates me on one level. And on the other level, it's like, show children, show the innocence, show the things that
Mhm.
are truly wonderful that you want to feel involved with in this life. And hopefully that message, stays after you're gone.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time today to talk about this movie, to guide me through something I'd never seen before and was kind of scared of watching for the first time, but I really, really appreciate it. To everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. As always, you can find the Dual Dialogue podcast, all episodes on YouTube and Spotify. And stay glued to the Dual Dialogue podcast YouTube channel and my personal entertainment journalism page, Cams underscore entertainment underscore corner on Instagram for more Halloween themed coverage coming up. I appreciate everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cam. You're great.